Hello everyone and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lectures. Today's lecture is on the life, legend and mysterious death of Wing Commander Brendan Finucane. It's a really exciting topic, but also quite poignant because it is, of course, his 80th anniversary of when Brendan Finucane died. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal, and can I begin by welcoming all of you for joining us. It's very appreciated, particularly if you're in London, as I am, where it is swelteringly hot, which explains why I'm slightly more dressed down than I usually am. But can I welcome all of you, whether you're in London or joining us from further afield. We're joined today by people from Canberra, Zanzibar, and even Portree. So wherever you're joining us from, thank you very much. Our speaker today is Dr. Joseph Quinn. Joseph completed his PhD at the Centre for Contemporary Irish History at Trinity College, Dublin, and in 2015, and specialised on the recruitment of volunteers from Northern Ireland and neutral Ire to the British forces in the Second World War. He has published a number of articles and book chapters derived from this research, and is currently preparing a book to be published with the Cambridge University Press. His current research focuses on Irish airmen and the British flying services during both World Wars, and he presented a fantastic paper for our recent seminar at RAF Museum Hendon, which was on freedom fighters, and his focus on the Irish airmen was particularly good. That's available on YouTube, and Jesse, I'll post a link at the end of this lecture so people don't leave us now, because it really was very good. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joseph. So Joseph, take it away.
Thank you very much, Harry, and could I just thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture on this 80th anniversary of the passing of Wing Commander Brendan Finucane. It's a great honour to give this talk, and I hope I do him some justice. It was a dull, cloudy morning at RAF station at Hornchurch on Wednesday, the 15th of July, 1942. The ground crews went about their tasks, preparing the assigned aircraft for the day's mission. That morning, pilots of numbers 81 and 154 squadrons were on notice that they were to take part in a Ramrod operation over northern France. They would be joined in this operation by number 122 Squadron, located at one of Hornchurch's satellite airfields at Fairlop, some 8 miles to the east. Hornchurch Station, closed in February 1962, is located at Uxbridge, and Fairlop is just a mile east of Woodford near Grange Hill. These 3 squadrons, along with number 64 Squadron, made up Hornchurch Wing. It comprised officers and airmen from Britain, the Commonwealth and Empire, and at least 2 officers from Nazi-occupied Europe. Number 122 Squadron had, until recently, been commanded by a Czech squadron leader named Franciszek, I think his name is Fatil, who was appointed early in 1942. He was the first Czechoslovak air officer to command an RAF squadron. Fatil had been shot down over northern France in May 1942 while on a bomber escort mission to Lille. Though it was not yet known to his comrades, he managed to evade capture and escaped France over the Pyrenees to Spain, from where he was later repatriated to Britain through Gibraltar. This happy news came perhaps too late for the members of Hornchurch Wing, who were about to lose a very recently appointed commander in the form of Wing Commander Brendan Finucane. He was appointed wing leader of Hornchurch in June 1942, having previously commanded number 452 Australian Squadron and number 602 City of Glasgow Squadron at RAF Kenley. He had already earned an outstanding reputation for tactics and flying skill, and of being a first-class squadron leader. He had become Fighter Command's top-scoring air ace, with the majority of his 32 kills being achieved on circus sweeps while in command of the Australians at Kenley Wing during 1941. Brendan had already been awarded both the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Distinguished Service Order and Bar, and having risen to widespread acclaim and national celebrity in both Britain and his native Ireland, at just 21 years of age, he was the youngest wing commander in RAF history. After flying his last circus with Kenley Wing on the 20th of June, and having had a massive farewell booze-up at legendary local White Hart Inn, which had been the boozer for Jeff Wellham, Brian Kincombe, and the other pilots of number 92 Squadron during the Battle of Britain, Brendan rose early the very next day to take up his new posting at Hornchurch, and he immediately got to work. Earlier that day, there was a visit by an army delegation to get the views of pilots on the effectiveness of ground fire, particularly small arms fire, on aircraft flying at low level. Ironically, the views of Hornchurch Wing pilots who regularly perform low-level sweeps at 50 feet or less while travelling at over 300 miles an hour suggested that the effect of small arms and low-flying aircraft, especially fighters, was likely to be minuscule at best. They were to learn otherwise 25 days later. After the party of army officers had lunched and departed, Brendan selected a new aircraft from the station flight, known as Spitfire Mark 5B BM308. He would begin by leading his new wing on a wing feint mission to New Haven and the Channel, and later that evening led them on a Ramrod mission, where they escorted 12 Boston bombers on a sweep to bomb the docks at Dunkirk. It was an uneventful mission, and although 12 enemy Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had been sighted, no combat was reported by any of the squadrons. The first day of sorties gave Brendan the impression he needed of the men over whom he was now taking command. This impression was that he would have a great deal of work to do to whip them into shape. The weather worsened over the next few days, giving him a chance to get a handle on his workload and to take his new pilots to task. He made two critical observations. Firstly, they flew too closely together while formation flying, and he tore strips of them for doing so, encouraging them to fly in a far looser formation or grouping, allowing for greater flexibility for when to break for attack or defense. The RT discipline, or radio communication for the rest of you, appalled him, and he would spend 2 weeks setting them straight on this, regularly pulling them into briefings to chastise them for breaking RT protocol. There were many other tasks that needed to be overseen, including the upgrade to the Spitfire Mark 9. Hornchurch's squadrons were chosen to be among the first to acquire this new variant of Spitfire, and for this reason, number 64 Squadron was taken off operations during June and July to re-equip and engage in a conversion course. After flying a number of routine missions with his wing, Brendan got an opportunity to perform an air test on one of the new Mark 9s. Lasted for 40 minutes, this flight would be the first and only time he would fly this type. He apparently revelled in the potential of the variant, and having struggled with the Mark 5B, which was consistently underperforming against the Focke-Wulf 190, he understood that the RAF now had the fighter it needed to get back onto par with the Luftwaffe. The first week of July brought even more bad weather and reduced flying time. Brendan would instead concentrate on monitoring the progress of the wing and carrying out various administrative duties alongside the commanding officer of Hornchurch Station, Group Captain George Lott, who lost his eye to a shard of perspex during the Battle of Britain and ended up flying a desk. Brendan was by now just about 54 hours and 30 minutes shy of reaching 1,000 hours of total flying time, but he would never reach this target. The following week brought some minor improvement in the weather. On the 8th of July, the whole wing was suddenly assembled by Group Captain Lott for a blitz talk on the subject of RT discipline. Brendan followed Lott and proceeded to give the pilots a bollocking on the matter, as well as addressing down on their general behaviour. One would be forgiven for thinking that he was a stiff character, but Brendan had begun his time as squadron leader at Kenley exactly a year before in exactly the same fashion. He clearly felt it was his duty to instill a sense of professionalism in the less experienced, but not necessarily younger pilots, to save their lives more than anything else. Later that same day, he would lead 3 operational squadrons of the wing on a rodeo, an operational sweep to Dunkirk. Aside from encountering heavy flak over Calais in the return home, there were no incidents. The weather worsened again, and on 10th of July, Brendan delivered a lecture on tank busting. On the 11th, number 81 Squadron was called to readiness for an evening roadstead op, with Brendan leading, but this was later cancelled. That evening, Brendan accepted an invitation to dinner from the Lord Lieutenant of Essex and his wife, and later was taken on a tour of the grounds of their house. Bringing him to the Rose Garden, Brendan was heard to remark, "Well, isn't this well worth fighting for?" On the 12th of July, a Sunday, the Bishop of Chelmsford delivered a service to the pilots of Hornchurch Wing at their dispersal area. Brendan slipped away to a nearby Catholic chapel for Sunday Mass. He was noted for his devout Catholicism and was an intensely spiritual man, like his father, who attended morning Mass every day at St. Winifred's, beside Kew Village in West London. It was evident to those who knew him that he found great comfort and solace in his worship. After Mass, he briefed his pilots, and at midday, he led them on a rodeo mission along the French coast to draw out enemy fighters, returning over Beachy Head at 0 feet. Later that same Sunday, the Wing flew Circus number 198, a mission to cover a formation of Bostons, which were detailed to bomb marshalling yards at Boulogne. The following day, Monday the 13th, the Circus mission to Boulogne was repeated, probably due to poor visibility on the previous day. The target again would be the marshalling yards, to be struck by Boston bombers, with the North Wheeled Wing supporting. This mission, carried out in the early afternoon, was recorded as having been successfully completed. On the evening of Tuesday the 14th, the Wing carried out a roadstead mission to the German naval base at Ostend, Belgium. 3 minesweepers were strafed, and one of Brendan's younger pilots in number 81 Squadron, Sergeant Sidney Mostyn, would acquit himself by pouring a share of ammunition into the anti-aircraft defences. If the weather was clear that evening when Brendan landed at Hornchurch, he might just have been lucky enough to see his last sunset. On the 15th of July 1942, the Wing was detailed to attack a German army camp located at Étaples, close to the northern French coast. This city was a very short distance from the coastal resort of La Touquet, which had been a favoured destination of both celebrities and royalty alike until the late 1930s, and saw personalities such as King Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson and even Winston Churchill visit its hotels and beaches. La Touquet is on the opposite side of the Conche estuary. Running along the mouth of the estuary was a small Luftwaffe airfield, protected by anti-aircraft defences. On the western edge of the mouth, at the end of a long beach facing the seafront of La Touquet, is a series of sand dunes on which small arms caliber machine gun posts were located. The strength of these anti-aircraft defences was not fully appreciated, and it was clear from combat reports recorded afterwards that detailed the outcome of the operation that Hornchurch Wing pilots were taken by surprise. That morning, the Wing's commanding officers were busy with preparations for the day's action. Squadron Leader Berry, commanding officer of number 81 and a native of Hull, flew over to RAF Northolt to collect reconnaissance photographs of the target, returning to Hornchurch at 10:45. Brendan, who normally led number 81 Squadron on ops, was apparently not supposed to be flying that day. However, he was informed that number 154's commanding officer, New Zealand-born squadron leader Gus Carlson, was ill with the flu, and he agreed to take his place leading 154. The Wing briefing that Brendan gave at 11:30 was light-hearted and jovial. He outlined the target, a hutted camp with various buildings clearly identified, and remarked that there would be dire consequences for anyone who attacked the officers' mess, as he had earmarked this building for himself. Brendan gave the takeoff time for 11:50 for 81 and 154, with number 122 Squadron taking off from Fairlock 10 minutes earlier to join up with the other squadrons over Hornchurch. Group Captain Lott was to take off 5 minutes after the Wing was vectored south to Pevensey Bay. His task was to follow the Wing as far as the coast and at 20,000 feet act as RT linkman, a communications link who connected the Wing while out of range over the channel with the air controller at Hornchurch. The Wing's intelligence officer gave further details of the target and its anti-aircraft defences, telling pilots that they should expect some light flak. Finally, the meteorological officer provided a forecast: scattered cloud over the target of 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Among the many routines and rituals that Brendan had brought with him to RAF Hornchurch was the curious custom of playing the popular song Tangerine on the gramophone prior to taking off on an op. It was something for which he was teased by his Australian pilots at Kenley, with his good friend, squadron leader Keith Bluey Truscott, apparently stealing and breaking his beloved record, an act that drove Brendan into a fit of rage. That morning, however, Brendan would not make it to the dispersal hut to listen to Tangerine. Sergeant Sidney Mostyn well remembered that he didn't show up to join the pilots when they put the record on to listen to the song. Whether called away to take care of an important duty or preoccupied by a personal errand, for some reason Brendan failed to observe his own pre-flight ceremony that day. Among famously superstitious RAF pilots, the breaking of such rituals was often considered taboo, and a harbinger of bad circumstances and even doom. At 11:45, all pilots made their way to their dispersal pens to be strapped into their machines, start their engines, and taxi out to line up for takeoff on the strip. It was 11:52 by the time the combined aircraft of the wing were airborne and formed up. The route taken by the wing first went east along the Thames estuary to get around the London Balloon Barrage, then down the Sussex coast to Pevensey Bay, where they crossed into the Channel. Squadron Leader Berry led 6 aircraft of 81 in the centre of the formation. Belgian Squadron Leader Previtt would lead 12 from 122 on the port or left side of the formation, with Brendan leading number 154 on the starboard side. Canadian pilot officer Butch Aikman from 154 had been selected by Brendan as his wingman and formatted to his right at Pevensey Bay to come into position as his number 2. With North Wheeled Wing joining up over Pevensey at 12:10 to provide cover just behind and above at 4,000 to 5,000 feet. From here on, everyone was on the lookout. It would take approximately 12 minutes for the wing to cross the channel towards Touquet. Group Captain Lott would have been circling over Dungeness, tuning in on the wing frequency to relay instructions from the controller and maintain a listening watch. At 12:22, the wing of Spitfires emerged at wave-top height from a layer of mist hanging over the channel, roaring over sand dunes on the eastern fringe of Touquet Beach, an area known as Pointe de Touquet. Mounted on top of the crest of the taller sand dunes overlooking the mouth of the Conch estuary was a German machine gun post, recently erected with 2 sentries manning what was probably an MG-32 light machine gun. Nobody noticed them until Aikman saw tracer fire hosing into the starboard wing of the formation. The burst of fire immediately struck Brendan's starboard wing and damaged his radiator. Immediately, a thick trail of white vapor began to leak from a gash at the side of his machine. This was the coolant, a vital substance that prevented the engine from overheating. It would leak out in less than a minute, and Brendan's engine would seize up just minutes later. Aikman, who was on his starboard side, saw the hits, and he broke radio silence with Brendan's call sign. "You've had it, sir, in your radiator." Brendan acknowledged with a thumbs up and immediately broke off into a hard bank to starboard, over the beach and back into the channel. Aikman followed him later in a right turn and noticed the machine gun post, a tripod set up in an unprotected ridge of sand 20 feet above the dunes, as he came back over the beach behind Brendan. Aikman lined up the target, dipped his nose slightly and strafed the position, tearing up the crest of the ridge and possibly killing the gunners and disabling the machine gun. The rest of the wing continued with the operation, but the mission was not as simple as they assumed. Sergeant Mostyn recalled in an interview with the IWM that a call had gone out over the RT. The wing code's been hit. This must have unsettled the pilots as they proceeded inland to engage in their strafing attack at Étaples. In number 81 Squadron's war diary, it is noted that the pilots encountered considerable flak in the target area, most likely from the airfield, and that 3 machines sustained damage, with Canadian Flight Lieutenant Walker's Spitfire receiving multiple hits, damaging his flaps and forcing him to make a belly landing upon his return to Hornchurch. Brendan flew out to sea, with Aikman flying just above him. It appears that they broke radio RT silence to speak to one another about the situation. Brendan's engine was beginning to seize up at almost 10 miles out. He was too low to bail out, and it was obvious that he would have to make a forced landing in the sea. Aikman could see him very clearly in the cockpit. His voice sounded calm and controlled, with no emotion. Aikman called out that he was going to climb up so that he could be better able to get a fix on Brendan's position when he crashed. And Brendan replied, "Get as high as possible." Before Aikman climbed up, he heard Brendan call quietly over the intercom in a calm voice with the famous words, "This is it, chaps." He just managed to see Brendan pull back the hood of the canopy and remove his flying helmet before he pulled away to climb upwards. It also appeared to Aikman that Brendan was loosening his parachute harness, which would have necessitated him undoing his harness straps. This was possibly fatal. This was the last time that Aikman saw Brendan up close. As he climbed up to 5,000 feet, Aikman watched as Brendan's Spitfire gradually descended towards the surface of the sea. He saw it level off, drop its tail, and fall onto the water. As the aircraft made contact with the surface, Aikman saw it disappear in a wall of water. Brendan's aircraft vanished beneath. Aikman circled overhead for 10 minutes, watching intently over the spot where the Spitfire had sunk. The only trace of the crash was a thin streak of oil forming on the water surface. Other aircraft of the wing joined and stayed for as long as their fuel gauges would allow, but there was no sign of either life or wreckage. The pilots of Hornchurch Wing then set a course for home, leaving Wing Commander Brendan Finucane to rest forever in the depths of the English Channel. There's a number of points that I wanted to go over. First of all, I wanted to make the point about what these operations were. When you hear about Ramrod, rodeo, roadstead, and circus, some might be curious, even quite knowledgeable people might be curious as to what these operations represent, what they actually mean. A Ramrod operation, such as the one that Brendan Finucane took part in on the 15th of July 1942, is a strafing attack on selected ground targets with machine guns and cannon. Rodeo is a strafing attack on targets of opportunity and also includes random intercepts of German aircraft. A roadstead is an offensive air sweep on German naval and shipping targets using low-level and dive bombing tactics. And a circus is typically, and it's a large operation, it's a mass operation where formations of up to 30 medium bombers, usually Bostons or Mitchells, are escorted by anything up to 16 squadrons of fighters, which is a very considerably large force. There must be about 400 or 500 fighters within that amount of squadrons. And these are sent to attack defined targets, normally in coastal areas in the continent of Europe. And the whole objective is to draw Luftwaffe fighters into combat. The reason these particular operations, these four types of sweeps, are important is because of the fact that they form part of a general strategy that was utilized by RAF Fighter Command for a considerable period during the war, really from the end of the Battle of Britain right up until late 1943. It was a policy of continuously harassing the enemy by crossing the coast and attacking very often targets of opportunity, but a lot of the time predefined targets. It later evolved into a strategy of providing bomber escorts, but it wasn't quite done on the same level as the American fighter escort, or for the bomber operations, the daytime bomber operations that the Americans began to mount from late 42 and 1943 onwards as part of the aerial bombing campaign over the continent of Europe. This was more to cause trouble, it had a nuisance value as opposed to having a real direct strategic threat to the German armed forces on the continent of Europe. So immediately one wonders, what was the purpose of Brendan Finucane's death for a campaign that really didn't seem to have any defined outcomes or objectives and didn't really seem to be having much of an impact in terms of achieving a strategic objective on the continent of Europe in the same way that the American strategic bombing campaign had, particularly from 43 onwards. And I just wanted to read a letter which was sent by Sholto Douglas, who was the commander of RAF Fighter Command, and he wrote to Sir Archibald Sinclair, the Air Minister. It's a letter dated from the 16th of April 1942, and it reads as follows. My dear Commander-in-Chief, it's the other way around. It's actually a letter from Sir Archibald Sinclair to Douglas. My dear Commander-in-Chief, thank you for your letter on the 14th of April and for your interesting statement in which you enclosed about your own and enemy casualties. 67 destroyed for the loss of 65 fighters, RAF fighters. I showed it to the Prime Minister. He was satisfied. It means hard fighting, but I remember in May or June your predecessor saying to me, we could afford to go on shooting down Germans at a ratio of only 2 to 1 in our favour. Today there is no doubt that equal losses in the air battle mean a reverse for the Germans. Your figures indicate that you have done better than that. Well, if that was the case, if he had done better than that, it's very difficult to make that out from the ratio of figures. It's a very slight margin. And the purpose of circus and ramrod and roadstead operations, beyond having a nuisance or harassment value, has been widely questioned by many historians who concentrate on aviation history, particularly during the Second World War. While I wouldn't be prescriptive on it myself, don't claim to be an expert on RAF strategy during the Second World War, but I have noted the arguments that are made by many historians like Richard Overy and also the historian James Holland, who makes impassioned arguments that this campaign was not really an effective one, and particularly in view of the fact that Royal Air Force Fighter Command resources were needed elsewhere, particularly at this point during the war. It was particularly in Malta, places like Malta, which required better fighter defenses. And Malta really didn't get Spitfires until 1942, and it was having to make do with Hurricanes, which were obsolete and not really fit for purpose in taking on either Italian Macchi or German FW-190s or even Messerschmitts, the newer variants of Messerschmitts. So they were constantly struggling. Also, the Desert Air Force was having to make do a lot of the time with substandard aircraft, such as at that point the Hurricane had been well surpassed, and they were also using American P-40 Kitty Hawks in the Desert Air Force in order to fight the Germans. And they obviously needed much better aircraft than this, but that was what they were given. Whereas the cream of the Royal Air Force, the best that they had to offer, was retained largely in the UK, among fighter wings such as the one that was located at Hornchurch or at Kenley or North Weald, or the wing at Duxford. These wings got the newest variants or models of Spitfires, which were top of the range, and essentially were able to prosecute these campaigns against the continent of Europe with very little effect, when in various different other theatres these resources were poorly needed. So the question is, why didn't they deploy more resources to these theatres, such as Malta, such as North Africa, or even the Far East, when these resources were desperately needed at this particular point in time? I think the logical answer to this is because of how badly the war was going in 1942. One has to remember that at the time Brendan Finucane died, you had the fall of Singapore in February 1942. Just a month before Finucane's death on the 15th of July, you had the fall of Tobruk as well. And so huge amounts of British and Commonwealth prisoners went into the bag in both of these defeats, and the 8th Army was in full retreat in the Western Desert. And by the time Finucane had basically taken over at Hornchurch, they had only just managed to halt the German advance, and they had won. They were just in the process of winning their first victory in the First Battle of El Alamein, which would halt the German advance, would halt Rommel in his tracks. But up until that point, people didn't see that there was much of a victory in this. All they saw was a British army, a very sizable British army in the desert in full retreat, being whipped across the desert by the Desert Fox. They saw huge defeats and growing Japanese advances in the Far East, and there seemed no end in sight. And at the same time, the Germans were on the move in Russia. They were on the move in the Soviet Union and Soviet Russia, and they were penetrating very deep into the Caucasus, heading for the oil fields of Baku. The news was very bad on all fronts. The only real major victory that the Allies managed to sustain around this particular time that people took any notice of was the Battle of Midway, which happened the other way around the world. And while that was a very significant news and people breathed a sigh of relief, one has to remember that people had gone through 2.5 years of war at this particular point and were getting pretty jaded and exhausted. And the scale of the defeats that were suffered by Britain and the Empire at that particular point were so catastrophic that the morale across Britain and the dominions and parts of the Empire was particularly low, particularly with all these prisoners and with all these dead and all the reports coming in of the shocking conditions that were being encountered by POWs and by soldiers at the front. It just really seemed as though Britain had reached the end of its, that it had reached the end of its tether with this conflict, and there seemed no end in sight. Now, what a difference a few months makes, because by the end of 1942, the tables had almost completely turned, and everything suddenly started to look like the Allies may be able to win this back, and the Axis suddenly were on the back foot. But at this particular point, it was a very bad moment. And in these circumstances, the deployment of Britain's fighter resources, particularly the frontline fighter resources that it had in Britain, to maintain, one, a defence of the United Kingdom, and two, to prosecute a campaign against the continent of Europe, it did not seem at that particular point whether that would be a worthwhile move. Now, if you look at what occurs over the course of the coming year, a growing number of squadrons and aircrew members and airmen are deployed overseas. There are more airmen sent to Malta. There are more sent to North Africa. There's a number of squadrons that are deployed to Gibraltar to support Operation Torch, and there are resources deployed overseas. But it brings us back to the question, why still continue to prosecute these seemingly pointless campaigns with ramrods, roadsteads, and circus operations, constantly eating up both experienced and inexperienced RAF fighter pilots, particularly, and taking the lives of air aces such as Brendan Finucane, and resulting in the capture and imprisonment of fighter aces like Douglas Bader. Why pursue such a strategy when it doesn't seem to have any purpose or any real point, or nor for that matter seems to be working? And the argument that I would make, not being an expert, is that RAF Fighter Command had to maintain an active front against the continent of Europe. This is a front line, no different in some ways to the Western Front in 1914 to 18. There's no particular point to the trench warfare that took place, but the line had to be held. And it was the job of Fighter Command to defend the skies of Britain, which were constantly being intruded upon by enemy bombers. That in night attacks, British cities were heavily bombed right throughout 1941. So Britain was still under very considerable attack. And these attacks proceeded further up the United Kingdom, even reaching Glasgow, Edinburgh, and as far as Belfast, which was one of the heaviest hit cities in the whole of the United Kingdom. So the Germans were able to press attacks, very large and heavy attacks, in quite a number of areas. And there was a real need for Britain's fighter defences to be on high alert, and more to the point, to be fully stocked up with the latest in aircraft technology, and also with the best pilots, and particularly to have the best fighter pilots to train up the younger airmen that were coming up through the ranks, people like Sidney Mostyn, who found themselves serving under men of actually the same age, such as Brendan Finucane, who were teaching them all the tricks of the trade. And it was important to train up this new crop for when the tables turned and when it got to a point where they would have to re-enter the continent of Europe, presumably through France, or as they would find out a year later, through Sicily and Italy. It was very important to get them experienced. It was important for them to get experience of attacking ground targets, and to have them constantly engaging in operations where they would encounter the Luftwaffe And it must also be remembered that the majority of the Luftwaffe's resources was deployed in other theatres, including the Mediterranean, North Africa, and in the Soviet Union. And only a fraction, possibly a quarter or less, was deployed in Northwest Europe. It was also very important for the RAF to show that they were prepared to go on the offensive and put the Luftwaffe on the defensive, which the Luftwaffe seemed to be from 42 onwards. And it's also important to remember, and this is a point that I've picked up from a few historians who've been proponents of the whole idea of maintaining the strategy that Trafford Leigh-Mallory and then his successor Sholto Douglas pursued throughout 41 and 42 in pursuing these sweep attacks. It's a very important point. They were gradually clawing back air supremacy over the Channel, and they were becoming more comfortable in asserting Allied air supremacy or superiority, as it was then, over the French Channel coast. And when you translate that to what happened in 1944, when Luftwaffe defences were completely scaled back, and when Allied aircraft virtually had an entire run of airspace stretching from Calais to Normandy, the results, the long-term results of the RAF strategy might be considered to have been considerably fruitful. These are some opinions that I've read, and it's an idea that I've played around with myself, but it's impossible to ignore the wastefulness of this entire campaign in terms of the lives that were lost. And the life that was lost on this particular day, 80 years ago, was a considerably important life, because Finucane was the top scoring air ace that Fighter Command had. He had replaced Bader when Bader had been shot down in 1941. He was not particularly comfortable with the idea of being Bader's successor. So it leads us to our next question: who was Brendan Finucane? Who was this young airman who, barely making it into his 21st year, managed to achieve the rank of wing commander, the youngest person ever to do so in the history of the RAF to date, and to achieve the accolades that he achieved and to shoot down 32 aircraft by the time he himself was brought down? How did this come about? Well, as many of you might know, Brendan Finucane was born in 1921. He was the son of a 1916 veteran who had fought in the forecourts during the 1916 Easter Rising. He had no further Republican activity after this particular point. He met Brendan's mother, who was a native of Leicester, when he was over in England in around 1917, 1918. And the meeting between Thomas Andrew Finucane and his wife Florence was an interesting one, because Florence had been engaged on a couple of occasions, at least two occasions, to men who lost their lives on the Western Front. The First World War was ongoing at that time. And so many young men from that locality were dying in the First World War that when Thomas Andy Finucane came across her doorstep, her mother remarked that there are so few men these days, so many men are getting killed, you better snap this one up while he's still around, or words to that effect. This is apparently one of the main reasons why they ended up getting married in the first place, because of, I suppose, it could have been true love, it could have been the desperation of the times, but they met during a period of great upheaval and great tragedy. There was a huge, enormous human tragedy unfolding, and they settled in Dublin. And Brendan was born in November 1921, just as the war. Sorry, it was November 1920. Sorry, I'm getting the dates wrong. He was born just at the height of the Irish War of Independence, and apparently had his baptism of fire when what were known as auxiliary soldiers or black and tan soldiers opened fire on what they identified as IRA irregulars in the area of Rathmines, and the bullets narrowly missed Finucane's pram. So this was meant to be his baptism of fire. So he certainly had an interesting start to his life. He was a very talented sportsman, a very talented athlete. And but throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Finucane family probably found themselves in very difficult circumstances, as many Irish families did at this particular time, because of the upheaval that followed Irish independence in 1922, the depressed circumstances that the country found itself in the 1930s economically, and particularly with the economic war. And it was very difficult to find opportunities. And the fact that they moved address 3 times in the course of their time in Dublin, and the fact that Brendan moved schools a number of times, was indicative of the fact that they were essentially, they were moving up in some ways, but it suggests that there was economic difficulties, which would not have been uncommon at that particular time. And it's very interesting about the year that Brendan and his family emigrate to the United Kingdom, when they emigrate to London and move to Castlegate, their home in Castlegate, in outside of Richmond on Mortlake Road, on Lower Mortlake Road. And that neighbourhood had only been built just 10 years earlier. So it was a relatively new neighbourhood. It was built on the site of an old militia barracks, and part of the remains of the old barracks can still be found in the back garden of 26 Castlegate, where the Finucane family lived. It was very interesting that these neighbourhoods around that particular area of London exist. They didn't exist only 2 decades before, and there were rolling green fields. These were not built up areas. So there was a great amount of construction going on in London at the time. And this points to the opportunities that were available for Irish immigrant workers at the time, many of whom went over to London at this particular time to seek opportunities. And in the year that Brendan emigrated from Ireland in November 1936, there was something in the region of about 80,000 Irish immigrants who left for the United Kingdom, which was a phenomenal figure for that particular time. And so the Finucanes were among that colossal wave of emigration that was recorded in 1936. So it's important to remember 36 was a very significant year in terms of Irish immigration, and it pointed to the dire circumstances that the Irish economy found itself in at this particular point, because of the effects of the Great Depression and because of the economic war that De Valera was mounting with Britain at this particular time, which did not come to an end until 1938. But the Finucane family settled in London, and Brendan started out as a trainee accountant. But he decided to enroll in the Royal Air Force, which he did in 1938. He submitted his application, and after carrying out been processed during a medical exam, he was offered a short service commission in the Royal Air Force. And short service commissions were offered typically for 4 years. And he had a bit of a shaky start in terms of his training. He was acting pilot officer on probation from October 1938. And given, his short service commission on a probationary basis, then he became pilot officer on probation around August 1939. He began at 6 elementary and reserve flying training school in Sywell, before moving in October to the RAF depot in Uxbridge. That was October 1938, and then moved on the 12th of November to 8 flying training school in Montrose. And he also took part in practice and parachute test flying in the maintenance unit at Henlow. He had a huge amount of difficulty with flying. He wasn't very good at landing and taking off, and he didn't show much promise. And he was coming very close to being given what they called at the time a bowler hat. That's basically where kicked out of the training program and you're sent off either to transfer to another part of the Air Force or to leave and head off to another service or head off to another duty, whatever you might be required for, whether it's war or peace. But he managed to turn a corner because of the help that he got in Montrose at the hands of an instructor called Dickie Legg. And as a result of this, he was sent on to the Operational Training Unit, number 7 Operational Training Unit, or OTU, at Hawarden, which is famous in Irish history because of a very famous meeting between Charles Stewart Parnell and Gladstone. And the OTU was actually located, I'm reliably informed, right next to Gladstone's house where he received Charles Stewart Parnell. And then later, he was appointed to 65 Squadron, because when he was at Hawarden, he converted onto the Spitfire, and he was a natural. He took to it. It was like pilots like Jeff Wellham and different other candidates for the Air Force who basically had difficulty when they were flying. They took a while to get used to the aircraft. They had difficulties flying the Harvard and the Tiger Moth. And these aircraft were they were deliberately difficult to fly. And once you mastered them, once you mastered, spins and stalls and learned how to get out of these, and once you learned how to fly properly and night flying and various different other things that were quite challenging until you got over them, then you could go on a Spitfire, because a Spitfire was a very delicate machine. And also, it wasn't necessarily the case that you were guaranteed to become a fighter pilot. You had to show certain, you had to perform in a certain way and have to show certain potential in order to qualify to train as a fighter pilot. But Finucane clearly showed that potential when he took his first flight in the Spitfire on the 13th of July 1940. Sorry, the 28th of June 1940. It showed that he was actually a natural Spitfire pilot. And at 65 Squadron, 65 Squadron was located at Hornchurch, where Finucane would later become wing leader. And at 65 Squadron, Finucane really made his debut. He became operational on the 13th. He joined on the 13th and became more or less operational on the 15th, which was, and then 2 years to the date that he became operational is the date that he died, the 15th of July 1942. So he showed great skill, great prowess in battle. He achieved only a few kills during the Battle of Britain. It was not until but he showed great ability as a leader and as a leader of men, and somebody who took initiative, and somebody also who demonstrated a great deal of professionalism in terms of how things were done. And this is probably the reason why he was promoted so quickly. His performance with 65 was said to be absolutely superb and outstanding, and he was recommended for a promotion and also a decoration upon the conclusion of his tour with 65 halfway through 1941, and then appointed to command the Australians' number 452 Squadron at Kenley. And it was with Kenley that he achieved the majority of his kills, and this is where he got into trouble. The pilots at Kenley achieved recorded an astonishing number of aerial victories, and this was queried by many officers internally within the Royal Air Force, particularly staff officers at Bentley Priory, who were on the lookout for squadrons that were inflating their tallies. And 452 came under surveillance for this. And Finucane was called to 452. He was called to account for 452's tally in around mid to late 1941, and he was called to Bentley Priory to account to this. And it was something that annoyed Finucane desperately, because he was actually quite a modest man, and I think probably very much resented having his integrity questioned. But it was never proven that these tallies or these scores were inflated. But certainly the British media, the British press, made a big issue of it at the time. And it was something that Finucane later remarked on. He said, "We have enough trouble fighting the enemy without being shot at by our own." This is the famous remark that Finucane made about this. But regardless of how how one author or another, or how one expert or another feels. I'm referring to Anthony Cooper, who wrote a recent book, Paddy, Finucane and the Legend of Kenley Wing, where he accuses Finucane of behaving like a petulant child, or words to this effect, over the whole tallies or kills controversy that erupted over 452's aerial battle performance. It's very clear that Finucane had a lot on his shoulders, and this is the fourth point that I'd like to make. Finucane was a natural-born leader. It was something that everybody who came into contact with him had seen in him. They'd seen it on the sports fields when he was in school in Dublin. A very famous Irish sports TV presenter was actually a classmate of his in O'Connell School, and he could see that he said you could see that when you were around Brendan, that he instilled confidence in you, that he was a leader when he was on the rugby pitch. He took control. He was able to basically lead the boys and give people a sense of calmness and confidence in what they were doing. And this was one of the reasons, one of the secrets of his success, and one of the reasons why he rose so quickly within the ranks and surpassed other officers who many would have said, in terms of the seniority of age and experience, should have been promoted to these positions much faster than Finucane was. It was because of this natural ability for leadership that he had. But he had this inherent ability to lead because he felt a need to look after people. And it's one of the things that, in terms of his family life, he was the older brother. He looked after his younger siblings. He was a very important contact point between the children and his parents. He was trusted by both his mother and his father, adored indeed by both of them, and was looked up to by everybody that knew him. And he had felt this need, I think, right throughout his life, to sort of be an example to others, and to be there to support people, and to lead from the front. And this was very much the way he was designed. But it must have taken a toll on him, in terms of the responsibilities that he had, in terms of the media pressures, the family commitments, and in particular when he became engaged, when he suddenly had a fiancée that he had to worry about. He had a commitment that he would feel he would have to honor. And he was, if you look at his record in terms of the commitments, the daily commitments that he was called upon to honor as a Royal Air Force officer, it was very clear that he took honoring his commitments, all his commitments in his career as in his life, extremely seriously. And with a person being called upon to do so much, and to risk so much, and to be so much to so many people, it was inevitable at some point that his nerve might have broken. And at this particular point, I'd like to advance the theory of why I feel Finucane went down on the 15th of July 1942. I believe there were two reasons. I think the main reason, what most historians, including Doug Stokes and several others who have written about Finucane, their opinion or their judgment of what took place that day, and also the judgment of some of his fellow pilots and what's recorded in the Squadron War Diary and in other comparable records, is that Finucane chose not to be a prisoner, and chose not to bail out and to risk being captured by the Germans, because he recognized that he was a very high prize, and the propaganda value of that would have been quite considerable. But considering the fact that Franciszek Fatiel had to bail out over northwest Europe in similar circumstances, actually very close to a facility on the Atlantic Wall, and had managed to actually escape occupied France and actually make it into Spain, where he was repatriated, showed that an Air Force officer could take that risk, and could possibly, if they tried hard enough, or if they were lucky, they could get out, or they could go into the hands of the French resistance or people who were sympathetic in France. It was certainly a chance that he could have taken. There was enough power in his engine to gain altitude, possibly to as high as 5,000 feet, where he could have bailed out safely, or to have crash landed, and he could have gone on the run. It's not very likely that he might have gotten very far. In all likeliness, he may have been captured, and he might have been quite a prize. But the other thing that I think affected him was the fact that he lost one of his wingmen, one of his squadron mates in 452, Keith Chisholm, in 1941, and this weighed very heavily upon him. What he didn't know at the time was that Chisholm actually he went down, but he was captured, and so he became a POW. And so Chisholm was not killed in action, and I think that as far as the squadron were concerned, Chisholm had been lost. They had no idea what happened to him. And also, one must remember that Brendan's commanding officer at Kenley, Victor Beamish, had also been lost in mysterious circumstances and never seen again. And this was something that happened quite commonly, and was something that weighed upon him. At the height of the Battle of Britain in September 1940, Finucane also reflected on the act of killing that he was regularly called upon to engage in, engaging the enemy and killing them, shooting down enemy aircraft. Something that also weighed upon him, and he remarked that he felt like a walking graveyard towards the end of September 1940. But he recognized that he had to continue on. In summation, I think that his flying out to sea and choosing to bail in the fashion that he did was a desperate attempt to try and set himself up so he could possibly be rescued, get out of the Spitfire after making a belly landing, get out of the aircraft, deploy a dinghy, and hopefully air sea rescue would be able to make it across the channel with Spitfires from his wing or from some other wing in support to try and provide air cover. But he was very close to the French coast for that, if that was his intention, and he was putting he would have been putting his comrades at risk. There were aspects of the circumstances of Finucane's his forced landing on the surface of the channel 10 miles out, which makes sense, and there are other aspects which either don't make sense or are perhaps they're perhaps a little bit perplexing. We don't really know what his intentions were. Everybody assumes that his intention was not to be a prisoner, but I think his intention also was to live. And I think where the loss of nerve came in is where he turned and headed for home as quickly as he could, even though he knew his radiator had been hit. And any experienced pilot would know that when the radiator's hit, it's curtains for the engine, and he's too far across the channel. I think some instinct in him wanted to get home as quickly as he could, back to base, back to the safety of England, back close to, he was on the other side of London to his family, back somewhere near to where his family was, and then eventually back to his fiancée who he'd left behind, who he didn't want to leave behind. He stood to lose a lot. He was a very young man who stood to lose a lot, and he had his entire life ahead of him. He was also aware of the prophecy of a fortune teller who he met when he was on a hospital bed in Dublin, when he was very young, when he was a young boy, and the fortune teller read his palm and foretold that the fortune teller apparently told his mother that he would die in tragic circumstances, such as this. There's another story about a fortune teller who said that he would have a watery grave. There's all sorts of stories like this within, I think, Finucane family lore, and within the general lore that exists around Finucane, which is known to anybody, any enthusiast who is fond of the Finucane story. I'm aware that there are questions, but I think what I will sum up by saying the following: that if Finucane was a victim of anything, I think he was a victim of Britain's priorities at the time, which was the need for heroes. And he was an exceptional hero, somebody who was highly decorated and somebody who had achieved a monumental amount by the age of 21. And when you compare him to other war heroes of a similar age, like Guy Gibson, who led the Dam Busters raid, and who also died in tragic and inexplicable circumstances, possibly due to his own actions. Gibson was also a very young person. He also had a huge amount of responsibility foisted upon him, and that responsibility in Gibson's case broke him. And it shouldn't be beyond the realm of imagination that Finucane maybe not broke, but certainly might have buckled slightly in the circumstances that he found himself in off the coast of northern France 80 years ago today. I think, lastly, that he's a person who deserves to be remembered. He deserves to be remembered in both countries, and he's a symbol of unity between the two countries and a symbol of the shared values that both countries hold dear, and what men and women of both countries fought and died to preserve and protect during the Second World War. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Joe. That's a nice point to end on, as you say.
I just wanted to make one last point. There's a movie been made. Completely forgot about this, and that's his fiance. There's a movie that's currently being made called A Shamrock at My Side. I wanted to give a shout out because apparently some of the members of the production crew are currently in the process of shooting. They were in fact apparently shooting today, and this is a production which is currently underway. Shooting in the UK. I don't know what locations. I'm sure lots of you would like to find that out. But they're making a feature film about Finucane's life and career and achievements. I just wanted to end on that point.
Okay, great. Well, we've got some time for questions. I'm going to give you a chance to catch your breath very quickly whilst I tell our audience about our next lecture, which is by Ken Delve on August the 4th. It's a Thursday, 6 p.m. though. He'll be discussing the Desert Air Forces, the crucible of air power. And also to encourage you all to register for our conference on Meaning, Memory and the Misremembered Past. It's a 2-day conference. It's free to attend virtually, or tickets to attend in person start at £35. You can find links to those on our Crowdcast homepage, and I'll also post links at the end of the event, including as well to the Freedom Fighters event, which Joe was involved in last year. But Joseph, I really enjoyed the lecture. It was very poignant, and I think it's all too easy to forget when we talk about the large numbers of personnel who were lost in the Second World War, that each one of those numbers is an individual story with a rich life, unfortunately cut short. But we've got some great questions which have come in from our audience, and the first is from Val Darcy, who asks, were there many frontline Irish fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War?
Yes, there were. I couldn't tell you how many there were exactly, because our information on the figures is very threadbare at the very least. 21,000, or just over, between 21 and 22,000 Irish joined the Royal Air Force in the Northern Ireland recruiting area. That's the information we do know. So there was a total figure of 71,450 Irish from North and South who joined the British Armed Forces in the Northern Ireland recruiting area. Of that number, 21,000 were recruits to the Royal Air Force. Not far behind the Army, but still, the Army was the leading service in that. But what's interesting is that in 1943, over 5,000 Irish recruits were recorded. Southern Irish recruits were recorded in the Northern Ireland recruiting area. That's the largest single tally. It's more than 3 times. It's more than 3 times the next largest tally for any jurisdiction and for any service throughout the entire Second World War. It was an unusually large figure for 1943, a colossal number going into the Air Force in 43. And there are many reasons for it. But in answer to your question around, in terms of frontline pilots, there was a huge number of Irish pilots in aircrew who served in Bomber Command, and a considerable number in Fighter Command. The numbers, I don't know about Fighter Command, but we do know that at least 10 Southern Irish pilots fought in the Battle of Britain, matched by around about 26 from Northern Ireland. So that's around 35, 36 in total for the whole island of Ireland during the Battle of Britain. In terms of the wider numbers, by the end of the war, I would say it was considerably larger. I do know of some Spitfire pilots, people like Joe Toll, who met Paddy Finucane at Hornchurch before he died. Also, a guy called Mark Downey, who was a Spitfire pilot as well. There are many others, and there's also Ken French, a very famous example of a fighter pilot, an Irish fighter pilot who didn't know Finucane personally, but knew a lot about him. But in terms of giving you an exact number, I couldn't give you that number because that's data that we just simply do not have access to at the moment. We will only have access to it when we have access to the Ministry of Defence records and are able to actually mine them gradually over the course of a couple of decades for data about how many were from all four countries of Britain and Ireland.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember as well the ground crew made up quite a
very considerable numbers. Very considerable numbers of Irish in Coastal Command, in Bomber Command. There's a huge number. Don't know why the Irish gravitate so many gravitate to Bomber Command, but there's a large number of Irish air gunners. Practically, there's a joke about an Irish navigator or an Irish tail gunner or whatever in practically every bomber that flew in the Royal Air Force. It's not quite that many, but it's a considerable number. And there were so many Irish Lancaster pilots at the end of the Second World War that you had, by the 1960s and 70s, most of the Aer Lingus fleet was being flown by men who had flown in Bomber Command in the Royal Air Force, Irishmen who had flown for the RAF in World War II.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next question. A bit of echo. Moving on to our next question. To our audience, if you have questions for Joseph, please do submit them using the Ask a Question function. So this question is around his supposed engagement with out of Galland. Is there any conclusive proof that he shot down Galland? I'm a great admirer of both pilots and love the idea of them having crossed paths and Finucane coming out on top.
Some say there is. I haven't come across nothing that I've read conclusively proves that he shot down Galland. One of the important points to make about Finucane's story, it's been very well reconstructed by authors like Doug Stokes did a fantastic job in terms of reconstructing his story. Doug Stokes had a unique opportunity in having access to interviews with dozens of individuals, including family members, but also people with whom Finucane served and people who knew Finucane personally. He was able to he did an expert job in terms of investigating his story. And also I have to point out there's other authors who have since reconstructed Finucane's story using records and various different other sources. And Anthony Cooper, the person I mentioned, is an Australian author. I found Cooper's account, while it was very interesting because it talks about his years at Kenley and actually in a very emotional way about the Australian involvement in Kenley. And I think the Australian story is an extremely important one. It often gets sidelined or ignored or overlooked when we look at Finucane's story. But I think we cannot look at the story of Finucane without looking at the Australians. And Anthony Cooper does a very good job in terms of reconstructing the Australian story within Finucane's story. But where my opinion of Cooper's work starts to go downhill like Aikman's nose depressing on the sand dune on the German machine gun post is where he starts talking about Finucane being a petulant child. When your reputation is under attack, when you're commanding a squadron and you're accused of inflating your tallies, of course you're going to stand up for yourself. And I think Cooper's conclusion on that is absolutely wrong. But going back to in terms of verified and unverified information, there is information that could be hearsay. There's information that's not properly backed up. Some of it is assumed. Some of it is relayed from family members, people who knew him, who drew conclusions about what happened in certain circumstances with Finucane, why he did certain things, and the circumstances behind his death. Some of it is based on assumption. So not everything is based on hard, concrete fact. And I think whether he shot down Galland or not, I think that's one that is as yet to be verified.
Okay, so we've got some questions around Do you know if Dowding was due to be replaced earlier than June 1940, and who was involved in that decision?
That's an easy one. That's Dowding and Keith Park were really removed by Churchill. I mean, Churchill. I think that really came down to Churchill. That was like it was. Isn't that? Or I'm going to say, Harry. Like, I mean, you're not probably. You're definitely more knowledgeable on this point.
I think the question is more to do with the earlier retirement focus. And in 1939, yes, he was due to retire. Newell was involved in that. I think it was Sinclair, who's the air minister at the time. And to be honest and fair to them, that was probably a correct decision given his age. And had the conflict not been broken out when it had done, it would have been a good idea to replace somebody so that the Battle of Britain was being fought by somebody who was fresher and younger at the very top. Of course, in hindsight, it was very, very fortunate that didn't take place because he did an excellent job for the majority of the Battle of Britain. But yes, that is what happened. So we can kick on to our next question, which
I'll add a little point to that also. It's probably a good thing that Dowding was replaced in 1940 and that Sholto Douglas was at Finucane's memorial service in Westminster Cathedral within a week or so of his death in action heading towards late July 1942. Because if Dowding had been still in charge of Fighter Command instead of Sholto Douglas, and he had been sitting next to the grieving family, he probably would have done something silly, like gone up to the family and say, "Oh, if Brendan, Wing Commander Finucane is standing right beside you," which he was known to do at commemoration or remembrance ceremonies afterwards. And he scared the skins off people with some of the stuff he came out with.
Yes, I think that a lot of post-war, he, understandably got a heavy psychological toll from having commanded the Battle of Britain.
That's true.
I think he
was a deeply spiritual man like Finucane.
Before we're pursued by Dowding advocates, we'll step away from this conversation and move on to a question from Ewan Grant, who asks, he says, you mentioned testing out the latest aircraft technology and mixing veteran pilots with new arrivals. At the time of his loss, what was the RAF's assessment of their latest models versus top-line German equivalents, and how accurate were these?
I think I could probably use your help with this, Harry, if you're willing to lend it. My understanding is that, well, certainly if you look at Finucane's, if you look at Finucane, and if you look at the performance of Finucane's contemporaries and other wings. Hornchurch, Kenley, North Weald, other wings that were operating out of other air stations in the south of England using the Mark 5B. The Mark 5B was massively outclassed at this particular point, and they were practically crying out. They were losing people because of how outclassed it was. They were trying to keep it. It was a good aircraft, but aircraft technology was being pushed, further and further down the field. Constantly. It was a constant game of innovation, really, from the Mark 1, Mark 2 onwards. And, they were eagerly awaiting the Mark 9. And I know that the test flight that Finucane took on, just remembering the date, when he took it on the 8th of July, 1942, that test flight, he reveled in the aircraft. He was able to make it to 36,000 feet in a matter of minutes with the aircraft. So he immediately understood that it was extremely powerful. And in terms of gaining your tactical advantage over your opponent, speed of climb was massively important. And this aircraft, more than anything else, was giving RAF fighter pilots, a much improved speed of climb. And that if that's the knock-on effect of a more powerful engine, you can imagine how much more other ancillary benefits are going to come with that in terms of the aircraft's performance, and also in terms of other improvements as well. But it was mainly the engine. It was the engine performance. Finucane thought it was absolutely spectacular, and he was really looking forward to upgrading himself to a Mark 9 when his opportunity came. But as we know, it never happened. Harry, what do you have anything to contribute on this?
I think that's a very fair assessment. The Focke-Wulf 190 was an outstanding aircraft, and when it was introduced, it really did outclass the Spitfire models which were in service. The Mark 9, which had a 2-stage supercharger, which is what I think gave it its additional power, leveled the playing field again. It was a very good aircraft, and so it's a continual back and forth in terms of aircraft development. Yes. We move on to Neil Carey, who asks, were the Germans in 1942 able to control their fighter defence through radar in a reverse of the Battle of Britain? Not sure if you want to tackle, Joseph.
My understanding is in the affirmative. Yes, they were developing radar technology to. I think they'd probably just caught up with British aircraft detection technology, radar, and so forth by that particular point. But I think their main concentration was on combating bomber attacks, night bombing at this particular point. The Lancaster was starting to come into service around this particular point in large numbers. I think by the end of 42, the Hamburg raid took place in, what date was it? I was trying to remember the date of the Hamburg raid. There was more of a concentration, I think, on my understanding is that there was more of a concentration on combating Britain's bombing campaign, nighttime bombing campaign.
Yeah, I mean, the Freya and Würzburg radars are both being used. Freya's the sort of long range one, and it does get used to pick up interceptions from sort of all formations. I think that's one of the interesting aspects of all of these missions, Ramrods through to circuses, is that the Germans don't seem to have been unaware that they were happening. They just don't seem to have been particularly engaged in trying to tackle them because they didn't see any advantage in it. And the likelihood of that is that they didn't get enough warning that they could get high enough up to then be able to take on these formations. So they'd have been fighting at a disadvantage. And realizing that, the likelihood is that they probably chose not to engage with them. I have to say, not my main area. I wisely chose to stop in 1940. But for those of you who are interested in circuses, our archivist Gary Haynes gave a lecture last year. And again, I shall share the link for that later. We move on again. I wanted to ask you as well, the memorial service for Finucane. There's huge numbers of people who attended.
5,000.
And I was going to say, I keep hearing numbers which go up and up, 2,000, 2,100, 3,000, 5,000 now. And I think this is a really interesting area. What drew these people to come to his mass? Were they predominantly Irish? Was it a wider sort of proportional representation of people within London? Was it mainly Catholicism, people coming, or was it more of a sort of general respect and people attending? And do we know this?
Well, it's a memorial service. So, in Catholic tradition, there's no body because his body was lost at sea. It was never recovered. So it was a memorial service, and not a funeral. But the similar rites would have been practiced, as would happen during a funeral. It just takes place in a different way. So it's pre Second Vatican Council. So it would have been a Novus Orderum Mass with a high altar, and Westminster Cathedral is still designed for that. So it's a kind of a high Catholicism, what we would call high Catholicism now, and it's a Requiem Mass, which is normally held in the aftermath of a funeral. That's what takes place for Finucane, and in the course of this Requiem Mass, a Requiem Mass typically would take in people who may not have been able to attend a funeral, or a larger number of people, and that's a typical custom thing. So it's actually a good opportunity. So the Anglicans would consider it to be a memorial mass. The Catholics refer to it as a Requiem Mass, but it serves both purposes. So it would have been the ideal opportunity to have the press there, to have senior members representing the government, the state, the royal family, and the armed forces, particularly the Royal Air Force. An ideal opportunity. It was very well attended. Like, I mean, the number that I came across is 5,000. That there were 5,000 people. And Westminster Cathedral is a very large cathedral. It's more than capable of handling a number that large, if not larger. what would have been happening is you would have had an opportunity for both the family to grieve, for them to pray and worship, to commend the soul, commend the soul to peace, and also for this state, it's an official event. It would be presided. May well have been presided over by the Archbishop of Westminster, who was then Dr. Bernard Griffin, and it would have been very. From what I've read of the event, it would have been very much an official event and very much an appropriate event for the state to convey its condolences to the family. Also, the important thing for what people may not be aware, during the mass, a white pigeon or a dove was seen flying across the transept and flew past a cross which was hanging from the transept over the high altar. And that was interpreted by many people who were there to be a sign that Finucane's soul was at rest. Now, I know for the non-spiritual among us, it's there's all sorts of tales like this and whatnot. But, I suppose at a time of tremendous loss and suffering, and a time when people turn to faith for solace and for a way of rationalizing what was going on in the world at the time, that must have been something that people drew great solace from, particularly after losing a war hero as considerable as Finucane was at that time.
Okay, I think we've got time for two more questions, and we've got two quite nice ones, which are, I think, much more in your wheelhouse, or at least I hope they are, which is this one from T. Were there any challenges / legalities of Irish personnel serving for the Allies, as neutral Ireland was obviously neutral in World War II? Also, any consideration to having Irish squadrons? And there's a comment from somebody else, which I can find it very quickly, was to do with, you mentioned that the UK government needed heroic figures. As you know, Churchill wrote a memorandum in October about the possibility of, October 1941, about forming an Irish brigade, army, or an Irish wing squadron air, going on to say the pilot Finucane might be a great figure.
Yes. That's right. So that's the famous Churchill. This was concerning the formation of the Irish Brigade, the 38 Irish Brigade, which was formed actually at a time when Finucane was really at the height of his power, or at the height of his career as a fighter pilot. So the idea for the Irish Brigade came from General Sir Hubert de la Puercoff, who was very much fighting the corner of neutral Ireland to the British establishment, and was been a real thorn in the backside of the Northern Ireland government, and constantly chastising them over sectarian policy and whatnot, and just really, not shouldering the war effort as best they could. Now, I think Goff's criticism of the Northern government was in some cases unfair, in other cases possibly fair, but he was playing a political game, and it was a bitter thing. It's a personal thing for him. But one of the things he does advert to is the fact that there's a larger number of Southern Irish going into the British Armed Forces than there is from the North. He uses this as a political playing card. But he says that this is not something that's been sufficiently recognised. And he's saying it in 1941 when Finucane's on the rise and people are starting to notice. An Irish airman has suddenly taken the top spot as Britain's leading air race. And he points to this, and Churchill he publishes an article. It comes to the attention of the Cabinet Office and Number 10, and Churchill it comes to his attention, and he proves the proposal to form an Irish Brigade 10 days later. And the 38 Irish Brigade comes into existence in early 1942, and simultaneously with the coming into existence of the 38 Irish Brigade, which later serves in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and ends its war in Austria, and had a fantastic record of service, and even invaded the Vatican at one point, marched in with pipe bands, and most of them were Orangemen as well, so they absolutely loved it. But the idea was put forward to form a Shamrock Squadron. It was known as a Shamrock Squadron, and Churchill famously made a mention. He said that man Finucane might be a good candidate to lead it. I think the decision against forming an Irish squadron was because it would be inflammatory to both the Northern Irish government and the Southern Irish government. In terms of what being Irish actually meant, it would be slightly problematic in terms of the competing allegiances that existed both within the island of Ireland and within Britain at that time, vis-a-vis Northern Irish versus Southern Irish, those who were loyal to Britain and those who were not necessarily loyal to Britain. It presented a problem because the Irish tagline was being used within the British the forces to cover Irish both north and south, and and that was the problematic thing. What was the second question, Harry? What was the other thing? It was sorry.
Were there any challenges? Were there any challenges or legalities of Irish personnel?
Yeah, none whatsoever. It was the policy. There was okay. So what was illegal was for ex-British officers or for representatives of the British legation, the UK representative's office in Dublin, and of any British military personnel who are based in Ireland for any particular purpose, or for British members of the British intelligence establishment, of which there are many based in Ireland. It was illegal. It was against the law for them to actively recruit Irish people into the British forces, and the authorities tried to crack down on that. But it was not against the law for Irish citizens to leave the state, either going into Northern Ireland or getting the ferries to Holyhead or to Fishguard through any of the ports on the East Coast to travel over to mainland Britain and to join the armed forces. That was not against the law. The Irish government knew it was going on. They allowed it to happen. They were perfectly happy for it to happen. They were happy for as many Irish to travel to the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland as possible to assist the war effort. They had no objections against it whatsoever. The only members of that contingent that they had any objections against them joining up were Irish Army deserters who were enrolled in the Irish Defence Forces, and who, particularly regular Irish Army soldiers who had taken an oath, and for obvious reasons that was frowned upon. But Irish civilians could work in the factories, or they could join the armed forces, and they even had arrangements to permit Irish people who were serving in the armed forces who wanted to come home on leave to come back on leave and deposit their uniforms at clothes dumps in Holyhead and pick up their Guinness sodden suit from whoever the last person who wore it.
Okay, and I think we've got this last question, which is a good one to end on, from Tony Fallows. What was the reaction, if any, from the Irish government to the returning veterans after the war?
Well, there was Irish veterans of the Second World War became largely forgotten in post-war Ireland, but they weren't forgotten to the extent that people didn't know that they were there. The people knew that they were there. I mean, there's all sorts of stories about, that man up the road, he fought at El Alamein. That guy. There was a man who lived just up the road from where I'm in Longford Town, County Longford. I'm in my family home right now, and I live on a road called the Battery Road. The reason it's called the Battery Road is because an artillery battery was located in an artillery barracks up the road from when it was a militia barracks. This part of the town formed part of a militia barracks, and Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson began his career at the horse barracks just at the other end of the road. Now, the reason I'm saying this point is because this is a military town, it was a garrison town, and it was not unusual for people to serve in the armed forces. There was a man who lived in a place called Legion Terrace, and it's called Legion Terrace because the British Legion built it after the First World War, who had a bullet lodged in his heart from the Somme, and he's lived up until 1940. He famously had surgery, open heart surgery. I think he was one of the first people to have it in the 20th century and survived the experience. But he had a bullet in his heart. He walked around for the rest of his life, or for half of the rest of his life, with a bullet lodged in his heart from the Somme. And at the other end of the road, you had a gentleman who was in the Royal Air Force, and after the war he set up a garage just up the road, which is still there to this day. And he was from the Anglo-Irish Protestant community. And I think, sort of the existence of these people was very well known in post-war Ireland, after both World Wars. But what happened was particularly because of the troubles in Northern Ireland, there was the growth of what has been incorrectly termed an amnesia. And in fact, it wasn't an amnesia, it was an asphasia. A late professor, Dave Fitzpatrick, who was a lecturer in Irish history at Trinity College Dublin, referred to this as asphasia, loss of speech. People knew about it, they didn't talk about it. And it's only now in recent years that we're starting to talk about it. But just to conclude, there was a meeting in the 1950s it was either the 1950s or the early 1960s. I can't remember when. I think it was the late 1950s of Éamon de Valera during his last stint as Taoiseach of the Irish Republic, or that's Prime Minister of the Irish Republic. And he met representatives of the Royal Air Force Association, and I believe Douglas Bader was actually at that meeting. There was a high-profile veteran representative, a fighter command veteran, very well known, and I believe it was Bader or somebody of that stature who was present at that meeting alongside well-known Irish RAF veterans. And the RAF actually, there was an RAF club in Dublin, but it was petrol bombed, unfortunately. And but the RAF club has been kind of reconstituted in the last 10 to 15 years in an informal way, and sort of a version of it meets in one of the 3 yacht clubs in Dunleary in South Dublin. But the RAF and members of the RAF, retired veterans of the Royal Air Force in Ireland, have done a fantastic job over the many decades since the Second World War of keeping the memory of what the Irish and the RAF did alive and keeping remembrance going. And it's almost as impressive as what Irish British Army veterans have done similarly to maintain the culture of remembrance in Southern Ireland.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joseph. Before I thank you properly, or conclude with that, allow me to thank all of our audience who've joined us as well. Had a great turnout. As I mentioned at the start, it's been a truly global attendance. It's been particularly nice to see so many people attend from Ireland. So thank you all very much for coming, particularly if it is anywhere near as hot as it is in London. A little bit of a hot box. So I'm going to say goodbye and go and get a cold beer. Whatever you are drinking, I hope you enjoy it. But Joseph, thank you very much for your lecture. I enjoyed it greatly.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.